Hello everyone, and welcome back to the HyBrix cultivation system. Today we're going to be talking about the second way to boost fertility using ferments and teas. So what we'll be talking about today is the advantages of using ferments and teas, both the advantages that one may have over the other or in comparison to composts and manures like we talked about last time. We'll also be talking about the difference between aerobic and anaerobic solutions, or liquids. There is a lot of debate about this, so we'll get into this. And then we'll go over some basic principles for brewing ferments and for teas, and we'll talk about some specific recipes you can use to make your own at home or on your farm. So it's important to start, I think, with the definitions of ferments and teas because these terms are often used interchangeably, even among people who are brewing them themselves, especially around teas. So we just want to be clear what we're talking about here. A tea is really an infusion of a plant material in water through soaking in water. So you think about tea that you drink. You're putting tea leaves into the water and just soaking them in hot water, basically. This is opposed to a leachate, which is water that's been percolated through a solid, some sort of solid compound, and has leached out of it. So think of like bokashi, like we talked about last time, and that liquid that comes out at the end. Or even putting water or some other liquid through worm castings. What comes out of those solids is considered a leachate. It's something that's leaching out. And then a fermentation, and this is where most of the confusion happens, is a natural chemical process which involves sugar, most importantly, and where sugar is broken down anaerobically. Now, some people will make teas, or what they call teas, aerated teas, and they will put sugar into that. And anytime that you introduce sugar, you really are working with a fermentation. So it's important to be clear because there are some different results and you may have different goals associated with making these things. So we just want to be clear what these are. And as you've hopefully learned in the rest of this course, definitions are important, and it's important to understand fully the concepts that you are working with. So if we have things like composts and manures that can provide organic fertility, organic material to our crops or really organic nutrients, then why would we use liquid teas or liquid ferments? Well, for one, they are faster acting than applying compost or manures. So typically a compost or a manure is going to take time to break down and work its way into the soil, typically at least weeks, if not longer. And even though manures may have some readily available nutrients, adding something like a ferment or a tea to your soil is just going to have a really quick, immediate effect on the plants. And depending on how you did it, it's probably also going to have a long-term benefit for the soil too. The other nice advantage of ferments and teas is that they can be applied through irrigation or sprayers or whatever you're using to water your plants. Now, with the caveat here that when you're making ferments and teas, you're typically going to have some solid materials in there, so you're going to have to make sure to strain out, to filter out those solids really thoroughly to make sure they're not going to clog your emitters. And even then, certain materials can cause clogging through the growth of biofilms. So it is something you have to be careful with, but it is possible to certainly apply these along with whatever technique you're using to water your plants. And then this other advantage here I call double use, because if you are soaking some sort of plant material in water in order to make a ferment or a tea, then you will eventually strain out those solids, and those solids can also be applied to your field. So they can be put into your compost, and in fact usually you want to put them in and compost them first with your other stuff and then apply them to the field. So you can apply your liquid and you can apply the solid. Now I'm going to assert something here that may be controversial to some of you, especially if you've learned to make actively aerated compost teas or just aerated compost teas. From what I've learned, the need for aeration in teas is mostly a myth. And I'm speculating that this myth comes from the very well-intentioned information put out there by Elaine Ingham and the Soil Food Web School, talking about how you always want your soil to be aerobic. And we know from the very first lesson, talking about the 4 elements, that this is true. You need to have air getting into your soil. However, this does not mean that the only good microbes and the only good environments are aerobic environments. And in fact, if you think about the process of making a tea, doing it in water, to me it seems a little bit counterintuitive and a little bit counterproductive to be trying to aerate an environment that is naturally anaerobic. Water has small amounts of dissolved oxygen in it, but for the most part, water is an anaerobic environment, and so you're kind of working against the natural state of things when you're trying to aerate something like that. And finally, there's evidence out there that farmers have had much success making teas without doing any aeration whatsoever and applying it to their plants and getting great results. So it does not seem that aeration is necessary. There may well be some benefits to aeration. There may well be some additional benefits to aeration, but the point I'm trying to make here is if you want to reduce your energy usage and reduce your labor and complexity, you can make teas without aeration. And so we're going to dive into this a little more, and just here's some information to kind of back this up further. If you are familiar with the history of farming, you'll know that, and this is a quote from Yongsang Cho, who's the creator of Jadam Organic Farming and a disciple of Master Cho, who came up with the Korean natural farming methods. He says that for thousands of years, farming was done through anaerobic fermentation. And this is what farmers have done, not just in Korea, but actually around the world. Natural organic farmers have used fermentation. And the nice thing about fermentation is that it actually minimizes nutrient loss. When you have oxidation and you have air being mixed and introduced into an environment, whether it's liquid tea or a solid compost material, compounds are getting volatilized and oxidized and being released, and so you're actually losing nutrients in doing that. And through fermentation, you keep more of the natural organic nutrients in the solution or in the material. And then also just want to point out that anaerobic environments are natural. And probably the best example of a really healthy anaerobic environment is leaf mold. So you think about leaves falling on a forest floor, and of course they're getting exposed to the air above them, but you're going to have several layers of leaves on the forest floor that are getting rained on and getting saturated with water. And if you've ever pulled up decaying leaves from the forest floor, you can tell that that's a pretty anaerobic environment. It's pretty wet there, and the mold that you'll see is growing largely without oxygen. In fact, those leaves often have even kind of a sticky quality to them. So this is a naturally anaerobic environment found in a forest floor, and we know from the discussion of succession and fungal species that forest floors are a really rich environment for plants to grow in. And in fact, a lot of the tenets of Korean natural farming or just natural farming are based on this idea of harvesting leaf mold to harvest those indigenous microorganisms, and especially those fungal species, and to incorporate that into your farm or your garden. Another anaerobic situation that occurs naturally is, think of a rainstorm. During a rainstorm, land is temporarily saturated with water, and so if all of your microbes were purely aerobic, they would probably die off in the middle of a rainstorm or for several days of rain. So microbes, as we're going to see, are actually flexible, more flexible than we think in their environments. And finally, there's kind of this myth that has developed that a bad smell equals bad microbes, or anything that's putrid is not good for your plants. Again, according to Yongsang Cho, this is just simply not the case, and you can apply bad smelling stuff to your farm and it will work well. Not in every situation, but think of the example of manures. Manures don't smell particularly well, but they are high in nitrogen. And so a bad smell is often actually a sign that something is high in nitrogen. Think of decaying food scraps that might be decomposing anaerobically. Those usually smell pretty bad, but they're also very high in nitrogen. And so when we talk about microbes, whether they're aerobic or anaerobic, we find out that it's actually a little bit more complex than that. So you mainly have 4 types of microbes when it comes to living with oxygen and without oxygen. In case you weren't aware, that's the definition of aerobic is with oxygen, anaerobic is without oxygen. So there are some species of microbes that we call obligate aerobes, and those only like an aerobic environment. You see how in the solution here they're gravitating towards the air. Then you can also have obligate anaerobes, which like only an anaerobic environment. But then you have these other 2 groups of flexible organisms. So facultative anaerobes are by nature anaerobic microbes, but they have flexible metabolisms. And so they actually can live in either environment, depending on the environmental conditions that present themselves. And the same thing with aerotolerant anaerobes. As you can see here, they are spread out throughout the solution, so they can live in both an aerobic and an anaerobic environment. And in fact, most of our plant beneficial microbes fall more into this facultative anaerobes category. So one thing that I found really interesting when I was researching different methods for brewing teas and trying them, what I found was that both the Jadam method of Korean natural farming and the folks from Dragonfly Earth Medicine both suggested nearly the same method of brewing a tea. And neither of these methods involve adding sugar. If you're not familiar with Dragonfly Earth Medicine, Kelly and Josh, they have been natural farming for over 30 years, and I consider them some of the premier experts on this stuff in North America. They're based in British Columbia. And the Jadam method is used by farmers around the world to produce relatively easy to make, inexpensive natural fertilizers. So both of these are really great sources. So what they both ultimately say is you start by filling some sort of container with water, whatever size container you want, whether it's a 55-gallon drum or a 275-gallon IBC tote or even a 5-gallon bucket. Then you add your plant material. So this could be weeds, it could be crop residue, it could even be food waste. Now there's a theory that weeds are good for making a tea because weeds tend to survive really well in whatever environment they're growing in, and so we want to extract whatever microbes or essence, you might say, of those weeds is making them grow so well and feed that to our plants so that they can grow better. Crop residue can be really good because if you actually feed plants teas that are brewed from their own native material, theoretically the microbes that plant needs are going to be within that tea. And then food waste is just really high generally in nutrients. Then there's a step of adding some sort of microbe source, and the Dragonfly Earth Medicine folks consider this to be an optional step, but Jadam emphasizes adding the leaf mold, but Kelly and Josh also add sometimes sauerkraut or kefir water, raw milk, whatever they have on hand, usually something to introduce the lactic acid bacteria, and then you let the tea brew for 4 to 5 days, which might involve pushing down or stirring the material once a day, but not a whole lot of stirring. And no bubbling, no aeration. And after 4 to 5 days, you should start to see bubbles forming prolifically on the top of the solution. And that's how you know that you've finished making the tea. Then you strain the plant material out, and your tea is ready to dilute and apply to your crops. And there's different dilution rates recommended out there, but I would say start with at least 100 to 1 and see how that goes. So again, just to emphasize here, when you're making these teas, there's no need for constant aeration. There's no need to add extra nutrients. A lot of people brewing aerated compost teas will add some sort of liquid nutrients to it, which in my mind kind of defeats the purpose of making the tea. You know, you're trying to harvest some organic materials that are going to be more effective and lower cost typically. And there's no need to add sugar to this. Again, sugar, we'll save that for the ferments, but for the tea, you don't need sugar. Now here's a slightly alternative type of tea that you can brew. It's called a sprouted seed tea. And this is a special tea just because of how the method that you use to make it. So they're a great source of enzymes especially, and natural plant growth hormones. So this is why you might want to try the sprouted seed teas. If you think about it, a plant that is just sprouting from a seed is going to have lots of growth hormone and enzymatic activity, so it's going to be really rich in this stuff, and so that's the advantage of the sprouted seed tea. and they're relatively easy to make. I'm not going to go into the steps in detail here, but we actually are including a worksheet with this session that will give you the steps in detail for how to make a sprouted seed tea. Now, another very useful homemade preparation or culture that you can make is lactic acid bacteria, otherwise referred to as lab. Now, lab is super versatile. Lactic acid bacteria have been proven to have many different benefits, from being a probiotic to even a growth stimulant. As you may know, they're really good for the human gut, and in a parallel way, they're really good for plants. So if you make your own or culture your own lactic acid bacteria, you can use these to inoculate your teas or your ferments. You can also just apply them by themselves to the plant, and they're a great immune booster in that way. And they actually will also help to accelerate decomposition of organic materials. So we've also included a worksheet with this lesson that describes the steps to culture your own lactic acid bacteria. Now, just to touch on leachate again, I mentioned two great examples of a leachate would be a worm tea, where you're basically just taking worm castings and soaking them in water, and then straining out the worm castings and feeding that liquid to your plants. It's still probably better for the soil in the long term to apply those worm castings directly, but again, if you want something that's going to be fast acting, you can make a worm tea, and you're still going to have those worm castings left over that you could just get some of the water out and then apply those to the field. And then if you're doing bokashi and you do it properly, you will be able to drain liquid from the bottom of your bokashi bin, and that leachate that comes off the bokashi is also a great amendment for your soil, rich in nutrients and growth hormones. You're also going to want to dilute that in water because it's very strong. Now, on to fermentation. There are mainly three different types of fermentation. There's a lactic acid-based fermentation, ethanol fermentation to make alcohol, and acetic acid fermentation. We are focused on and we want to do the lactic acid type fermentation. We do not want to do a fermentation that's going to make a lot of alcohol, because alcohol is actually poisonous to plants. So we don't want to be feeding plants alcohol, although most ferments will have some trace amounts of alcohol in them that is actually okay for the plants, but in very, very small quantities. You don't want to feed a lot of alcohol to the plants. And then an acetic acid fermentation is what results in vinegar. And vinegar does have some horticultural uses, but it's not quite as useful as a lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentations are what produce fermented foods like sauerkraut. And as you may know, fermented foods like sauerkraut are really good for the gut, and so they're also really good for the soil. Now, why would we choose to do a fermentation over a tea? Well, there's a couple additional advantages over a tea. Fermentations, because you're going to be adding sugar, actually have a shelf life. They're going to keep longer. So if you want to make something that you can continue to use for up to a year and sometimes even longer, then a fermentation is going to be good. And also, through the process of fermentation, that sugar, through osmotic pressure, is helping to extract a lot more material from the plant. And so your fermentations are just going to kind of pack a stronger punch. And you'll typically see an even more immediate plant reaction to a ferment than to a tea. So the main kind of beneficial fermentation that you can make at home that's typically talked about, especially in Korean natural farming, is called fermented plant juice, or FPJ. And there's a variation of this called FFJ, fermented fruit juice, which you can also do. But the basic idea is you're making this by fermenting plant material. It's often advised to use material from the same plants that you are growing. You're going to ferment by adding brown sugar or molasses, typically. You can use other sugars. You just want to make sure you're not using pure cane sugar, because that's had a lot of the nutrients extracted from it. Think of it as being kind of bleached. So we want sugars that actually still have a lot of the good minerals in them. And brown sugar or molasses or even raw cane sugar are better sources of sugar. And it's optional, but you can also add lab to your fermentation. So here are the steps for making fermented plant juice. First, you're going to want to weigh out your plant material, because ultimately you want to get roughly the same weight in sugar to add to your solution. So you take that weighed out plant material, take that sugar, mix them together into your water, into your container, and at this point is when you add the lab, if you're going to do that. and you want to fill your container all the way to the top. Don't leave any headspace. In fact, it's even good if it's overflowing just a tiny bit so that you can really compress the lid onto it. But you do also want to cover with a breathable lid because there's some gas that's going to be produced in this process. You want to be able to let that gas out. Then you're going to leave it for 5 to 7 days. Sometimes it takes longer, mainly depending on your ambient temperature. If it's cooler, it will typically take longer. But you're doing the fermentation at ambient temperature. There's no need to add any extra heat. And then at the end of the fermentation, you're going to separate the liquid and the solid material with a strainer. And again, you can put that solid material back into your compost. And then you've got your liquid and it's ready to use. And this stuff, again, is pretty powerful. So you can dilute it at anywhere from 4 to 10 milliliters per gallon, which is a ratio of around 300 to 1. So it's pretty strong stuff. And finally, I do want to talk about Bioflux a bit here because Bioflux is kind of an all-in-one combination of a bunch of these things we've just talked about. So we call it a fermented plant boost. It's not exactly a fermented plant juice because we don't use live plant material in it, but we use other materials that we all know are very beneficial for the soil, like worm castings and kelp and even whey and lots of other good stuff all goes into here. It gets fermented, and as a result, there are lactic acid bacteria in here. There's tons of enzymes and growth hormones and live microbes themselves. So there's bacteria as well as even fungal spores. And there's lots of organic nutrients in here. Even though Bioflux does not have an NPK number, there's no readily available plant nutrients, there are plenty of nutrients bound up organically in the bodies of the microbes and the rest of the material. So Bioflux is a really great all-in-one solution. It's honestly what I use on my garden, and I don't really use anything else besides worm castings and a little bit of rabbit manure that I'm lucky to have access to. So if you're not wanting to go through the trouble of making all this stuff yourself, Bioflux is a great solution. And 2 more little benefits. It is organic certified by the California Department of Food and Ag, the strictest organic certifying body in the country, so we guarantee a really high standard for it. And it is pre-filtered, so it will not clog your emitters. You can put it into irrigation and spreaders. All right, that's it for the lesson on teas and fermentations. And that is the end of section 2 of this course. So we're almost done here. Next section, we're going to talk about troubleshooting plant problems. And really, this is going to be a review of the stuff that we've talked about throughout the rest of the course. And we'll look at some different nutrient deficiencies and other problems that you may come across in the course of growing that we can then apply the previous lessons to fixing those problems. So, thanks for joining, and we'll see you next week.